Hello everyone and welcome to the National Army Museum. Jessica.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you to everyone who is here in the room and with us online. Thank you particularly to anybody who is rejoining if you tried to join in February and failed due to a very badly cancelled train. My apologies for that. I am delighted to be here. So, in 1917, the British Medical Journal published an article entitled "The Royal Army Medical Corps and Its Work." Over 2 weeks and 15 pages, the article traced the work of the British military medical services from stretcher bearing in the front line through the care provided in military hospitals on the home front, concluding that, quote, "As far as the British people are concerned, the work of the Royal Army Medical Corps has given the greatest satisfaction, and it is believed that after the war, when details become known to those capable of assessing its more scientific aspects, it will be acknowledged that the Corps has taken full advantage of the opportunity offered for advancing precise knowledge of medicine and surgery, as well as of means of handling vast numbers of sick and wounded men." This early judgment of the work of the RAMC during the First World War has often been reflected in later analyses, many of which have focused on the role of the war in driving medical developments. As Roger Cooter noted in 1990, war in relation to medicine remains dominated by a single commonplace, namely that medicine stands alongside the munitions industry as one of the great beneficiaries of war. For all its violence and destruction, the conflict of the First World War in particular, provided the scope for medical advances, the development of new techniques such as blood transfusions and plastic surgery, to new knowledge and awareness of illnesses, including tropical diseases and psychological trauma. The global scale of the conflict allowed such new techniques and knowledge to spread internationally, nor was development experienced solely in medical terms. Socially, the war gave vast swathes of European men access to medical care, which would have either been unavailable to them or which they would have had to pay for in civil life. As a result, according to historian Fiona Reid, men of all nationalities came out of the trenches with the firm belief that because they had gone to war, they deserved good state-funded medical and social care, not just during the conflict, but afterwards too. In other words, at least in Europe, and Reid is looking at Britain, France, and Germany comparatively in her work, the war laid the foundations for medical welfare states as we have come to know them today. This rather hagiographic interpretation of military medical services during the war has not, however, gone unchallenged. Indeed, during the war books boom of the late 1920s, the image of the regimental medical officer who served on the front, which emerged from soldiers' memoirs, was more likely to be that of a drunken bully ready to dose out medicine and duty, or the emetic number 9 pill, than one of heroic self-sacrifice. Medical advances can also be read in ambivalent terms, often occurring in conditions that today would be considered not merely experimental, but outright unethical. Leon van Bergen, for one, has argued that the failure rate of experimental treatments, such as injecting wax into the face of a disfigured man in an attempt to recreate a cheek, is reason to question the usefulness of wartime experiences for medical care and civilian life. New medical expertise was often far less relevant in other contexts than we might suppose, and it was gained at inordinate cost. So how are we to understand the work of the medical services during the First World War, particularly in the British context, which is the topic of my talk today? What I want to do this afternoon is to look at medical innovation during the war, but from a slightly different angle from many of the previous histories that I've touched on, which have tended to look at innovations as they were developed by the medical profession, so doctors and scientists, and applied in institutions such as hospitals. Instead, I want to concentrate on medical care in the front line, specifically the care provided not so much by doctors who served as medical officers, although I will be touching on examples of these, but by the men of the ranks of the Royal Army Medical Corps who served as stretcher bearers and nursing orderlies, usually with little or no formal medical training. So to be a medical officer in the British medical services during the First World War, you had to have professional medical qualifications. You had to be a doctor. If you were not, you could serve in the ranks of the Corps. In addition to looking at how medical innovations could both help and hinder the men of the ranks in their work as providers of caregiving, I will discuss their use of improvisation. The combination of innovation and improvisation, I will suggest, did allow the medical services to make advances in skills and knowledge during the course of the war, although in a way more qualified than the British Medical Journal might have wished to acknowledge in 1917. The innovations and improvisations I'll be looking at relate to both treatments and transportation of patients, the two aspects that these men were most concerned with. It reflects the two primary roles of the medical services in wartime overall, certainly in the eyes of the military authorities, which were to clear the field of battle so as not to impede the advance of uninjured soldiers, and to return sick and wounded men to health as rapidly as possible in order to conserve manpower. And as I argue in my book, An Equal Burden, there is heavy emphasis on the recycling of soldiers through the medical services, as we'll come to in a moment. So before turning to the discussion of innovation and improvisation in detail, I want to give a quick overview of the system of evacuation, this recycling of men, which structured the work of the medical services throughout the war. The system I'm going to be discussing primarily reflects the static conditions of trench warfare, which only really developed after the initial war of movement came to an end in 1915, and which then broke down again during the Spring Offensive and the 100 Days campaign of 1918, when the return of rapid retreat and advance first collapsed and then strung out to breaking point the lines of evacuation. Mark Harrison, in A Medical War, his history of the medical services in the First World War, gives the best overview of the way in which these changing military conditions shaped medical care provision throughout the war. But I'm going to be concentrating on that period of static trench warfare, which we tend to think of as defining the First World War. So that, because the majority of the war, the stasis of the front line system of trench war defined the work of the RAMC in evacuating and treating the sick and wounded. I think it's the most useful way to understand the system overall. So, how is a man wounded in the front line evacuated and cared for? In the first instance, he would be expected to care for himself, or a comrade would care for him, using the first field dressing, which I'll be discussing. Oops, sorry, that's not the slide I intended. I'll be discussing in a little bit more detail in a moment. If he could walk at this point, he would make his own way to a walking wounded collection point or a regimental aid post, which is the first on this slide. If he couldn't, he would wait to be collected by a regimental stretcher bearer, which is this image here. These were men who were members of the regiment. They were not members of the Royal Army Medical Corps. They volunteered or were volunteered to serve under the regimental medical officer who would train them in stretcher-bearing techniques and very basic first aid. And they were the ones who were allowed to go out into no man's land to collect and bring back the wounded. The Royal Army Medical Corps is not allowed to go out into no man's land. So the regimental stretcher bearers would carry him to an aid post, which was located in or just behind the front lines, where the wounded man would be given basic first aid and have his details logged by the regimental medical officer, assisted by his single orderly, who was usually a Royal Army Medical Corps non-commissioned officer. So the regimental medical officer was also an RAMC, a member of the RAMC, but those were the only two RAMC members attached to teeth regiments or teeth units. From the aid post, the wounded man would be taken by RAMC stretcher bearers. And it's a little bit difficult to tell from these images because in the regimental stretcher bearer image, it's quite small, but you can just about see they're wearing brassards, which are temporary red crosses, which slide up over their uniform arm. The RAMC stretcher bearers, by contrast, have patches sewn onto their arms, so they're permanent indications of the unit they belong to, those red crosses. The RAMC stretcher bearers would take the wounded man to a dressing station. I think that is a dressing station, in fact, which would be manned by tent or nursing orderlies of the field ambulance to which the RAMC stretcher bearers were attached. The field ambulances were established RAMC units of 193 men, divided into 3 sections, each section containing 36 bearers, 13 to 15 tent orderlies, and up to 3 wagon orderlies who were responsible for equipment. Orderlies ran the dressing stations, bearers provided the transport, and the wagon orderlies cared for the unit's kit. Depending on the distance from the front line, the wounded man might be taken in several relays of field ambulance bearers through a number of advanced dressing stations before reaching a main dressing station. At a dressing station, either advanced or main, he'd have his wounds dressed and he could receive a hot drink and a cigarette if he was in condition to do so. So men with abdominal wounds, for instance, would not be allowed any sort of refreshment because it might kill them. Main dressing stations were sited near roads, and the next stage of a wounded man's journey would generally be by ambulance wagon or increasingly by motor ambulance to the casualty clearing station. And this is a point of confusion that an ambulance refers to the established unit during the war. So to distinguish the actual vehicle, you have ambulance wagons, which are horse-drawn, or motor ambulances, which are petrol-driven or contain combustion engines. Although an integral part of the medical evacuation process, motor ambulances were organized and run in convoys not by the RAMC, but by the RASC, the Royal Army Service Corps, which also oversaw the work of volunteer motor ambulance units. Drivers of motor ambulances were mechanics rather than medical personnel. And motor ambulances themselves were spaces of transport rather than care, often very dangerous ones. And this also applies to the horse-drawn ambulance wagons. Their drivers were experts in animal care, not human care. They were not responsible for the medical care of the men in their command, although they very often took emotional responsibility for it. Traveling in poorly sprung vehicles over rough terrain was at best painful and claustrophobic. At worst, it could cause wounds to reopen, resulting in hemorrhages. And because of the amount of space, there would very rarely be anyone with any sort of medical expertise with the ambulance. Sometimes medical orderlies or nurses would travel with the ambulance, but this was not a regular assignment. It was simply that they needed to move from one unit to another. So often these men suffering from hemorrhage wouldn't have any medical care during the transportation. Motor ambulance convoys were also at risk from shelling and accidents on crowded roads where men and supplies going up the line were always given priority, over those coming down the line, however badly injured those men might be. The casualty clearing station was the next stage in the man's journey from the front line, and it was the name given to what had been known as a field hospital in previous conflicts. So if any of you have encountered notes from a field hospital from the Boer War, that would have been what the casualty clearing station was in that conflict. The name was changed in 1915 over concerns that public perception in Britain of these units was as spaces of long-term care, that idea of a hospital being somewhere where men were to be held for long-term care, rather than simply stations along the line of evacuation. Rather ironically, the static nature of trench warfare meant that over the course of the war, casualty clearing stations became increasingly less mobile than the old field hospitals had been, and thus more hospital-like, providing spaces for frontline surgery and the treatment of short illnesses requiring bed rest. And you can see from this image, it's actually a semi-permanent hut that's been built in this case, although more often they were tents with duckboards in between rather than buildings. Casualty clearing stations were staffed by their own establishment of doctors, orderlies, and trained military nurses of the Queen Alexandra's Imperial Nursing Service or the Territorial Forces Nursing Service. And this was the closest to the front line that women were allowed to serve by the British military authorities. So when nurses' accounts of serving overseas talk about serving in France. If they are serving with one of the officially established military medical services rather than one of the ad hoc voluntary medical services attached, the casualty clearing station was as far forwarded as women were allowed to serve, and only those of the official military services, not the VADs who served under the British Red Cross, who all served at base hospitals, which I will come to in a moment. So just as main dressing stations were sited by roads, so casualty clearing stations were sited at railheads. And once stabilized, a wounded man could be evacuated by train. Even short journeys by train could take many hours, as on roads, traffic going up the line to the front was always given priority of those coming down to base. Ambulance trains took wounded men to base hospitals, which were located at the major ports, Boulogne, Rouen in France, or Alexandria in Egypt, which were often housed in existing institutions. I'm not 100% sure what institution this was, but French and Belgian hospitals, schools, and similar institutions are converted into base hospitals during the war. Base hospitals were staffed by RAMC medical officers, trained nurses, and British Red Cross Voluntary Aid Detachment nurses who were on overseas service. They were fully functioning military hospitals where men could receive longer-term treatment before being discharged to convalescent camps and ultimately returned to their units. So for many men, that was the end of their evacuation. They would then be recycled back through the convalescent camps and back into the front line, into frontline service. If, however, a man received a blighty wound, one so serious that it would require complex surgery, longer-term care and rehabilitation, or even eventual medical discharge from the armed forces, he'd be transferred to a hospital ship for transportation to Britain. For those serving in the Middle East, Alexandria served both as a base and a permanent, and in some cases, to men's care. Once in Britain, more hospital trains would take the man to a home military hospital staffed by VADs and RAMC orderlies under the authority of an RAMC medical officer and a trained matron. This is what I think of as my local military hospital, number 2 Northern General Hospital, Beckett Park in Leeds. Beckett Park was a teacher training college that was commandeered in the early months of the war and became the site of the, Northern Command's second military hospital. It then expands to the East Leeds Infirmary, which becomes an annex with a specialism in dental and treatment of dental wounds and facial injuries, as well as an orthopedic specialism during the war. But this is the hospital that I focused quite a lot of my research on when I was starting out with this project. So in the home hospital, a man could receive specialist treatment. There were units specializing in orthopedic care, facial injury. Men who were blind would be placed on specific wards, long-term gas, the long-term effects of gas, psychological wounds, etc. Each had its own specialist unit in these hospitals. Before being discharged to an auxiliary hospital to convalesce, and this again is a local one to Leeds. This is Gledhow Hall. And from an auxiliary convalescent hospital, assuming he was not then discharged from the military due to health, he could be returned to military service, usually via a rehabilitative training camp, and Blackpool has one of these, which men in the north tend to be sent to before they're returned to their unit and overseas service. To summarise then, treatment along the line of evacuation occurred in the spaces of care, which are the shapes on this diagram, and transport occurred along the lines that I've drawn in between. Innovations and improvisations can be found in both the shapes and the lines. And for the remainder of my talk, I'm going to focus on the place of both in the space between no man's land and the casualty clearing station where the men of the RAMC worked. Although actually, I'm going to vary this slightly and start in no man's land, and not with the RAMC men, but with the technologies of first response and first aid that were in the hands of the soldiers. So these technologies weren't in and of themselves innovative. The first field dressing, which was carried by all service as part of their regulation kit, had, for example, had first been introduced as a concept during the Crimean War. It comprised a wool pad, a square of gauze, and a cotton bandage enclosed in a waterproof jasone or wrapping. And the dressing was designed to be used as first aid by the soldier himself, or as I said, by one of his comrades. Similarly, the triangular bandage, which you saw an image of in the cover slide of this talk, formed a key element of surgical haversacks, medical companions, and fracture kits, which accompanied regimental medical officers in the work in the front line from the early months of the war and had existed during previous conflicts. The triangular bandage formed part of first aid practice throughout the 19th century. By the First World War, such bandages were a central part of St. John Ambulance first aid training, being viewed as a universal tool for the treatment of a variety of wounds and fractures. That's a quotation from the 1909 training book. As the St. John Ambulance had been providing first aid training to the territorial forces, medical services, since the Corps' formation in 1908, as well as to civilian voluntary aid detachments since the end of the 19th century. Familiarity with this technology among military doctors and many men who might have volunteered with the St. John Ambulance before the war or outside of their military service would have been extremely common, and certainly for doctors would have been nearly as ubiquitous as the first field dressing was among soldiers more generally. The innovations, that was not supposed to be a new slide. The innovations that these technologies represent, therefore, is the democratization of first aid provision and the medical knowledge associated with it during the war. Every soldier would have at some point in his service encountered the first field dressing and been instructed in his use, either as a padded bandage or a tourniquet. This might take place during training, or it might take place in a lecture by the medical officer during a rest period overseas. Prior to the war, the medical profession had often been highly defensive of the democratization of medical expertise, arguing that the social innovation represented by the first aid movement, which emerges in the second half of the 19th century in Britain, and was driven by organizations such as the Order of St. John, posed a risk to accident victims. That's how first aid was positioned prior to the war as a way in which volunteers could support accident victims. The spread of first aid technologies throughout the war served as a catalyst for the spread of such first aid practices and helped to settle the argument that was had between doctors and first aid innovators on the side of civilian first response. First aid technologies also drove economic innovation behind the lines. To meet the demand for the number of aseptic dressings required by the War Office to provide all these first field dressings to servicemen, the Thackeray Pharmaceutical Company in Leeds is one example that invested in specialist technologies, which it continued to use long after the war. That building still exists. It's no longer the home of Thackeray Pharmaceuticals, but in the top room they had a specialist sterilizing machine which carried on working throughout the interwar period. The uses made of first aid technologies also point to the importance of innovation in frontline care. While all men were supposed to be trained in the use of their field dressings by their regimental medical officers, they often used them in unauthorized ways, from applying multiple dressings to a single wound — this was formally forbidden in the training material — to substituting a puttee for the cotton bandage. Puttees are, it should be said, probably the frontline serviceman's most important improvisational tool. They keep on turning up. As well as holding dressings in place and acting as tourniquets, they could be substituted for the equally flexible triangular bandage, where a man couldn't get access to one, as a bandage for wounds, slings for broken bones or for fastening splints. Now, the illustration shows triangular bandage use, but puttees could be substituted in all these cases, and very often were. Puttees also had a role to play in the improvisation of transport by both regimental and RAMC stretcher bearers. Laced between two rifles, puttees could form a webbed stretcher. A greatcoat attached between rifles by the sleeves could form a more conventional flat stretcher base. The most commonly used form of transport improvisation in Just Behind the Lines, however, was undoubtedly the manual carry. This is from the St. John Ambulance Training Manual, whereby the bearer used his own strength, sometimes combined with that of a comrade, to transport the wounded man. So important were these forms of improvised transport in the disrupted and shifting landscape of the First World War battlefield that the training manuals used by the RAMC formalized them as part of the instruction given to recruits to be learned alongside the more formal drill. Unfortunately, it's all in written text. It doesn't make for a very good slide the way it's laid out. One of the reasons why such transport improvisation was important, particularly on the Western Front, was due to military innovations in trench design, which developed throughout the war. Particular innovations which proved problematic for RAMC stretcher bearers were the zigzag trench, and from 1917, the Twinton trench. So the zigzag trench, which was designed to prevent an invading enemy from gaining a clear shot down the length of the trench, introduced tight corners which were physically impossible for the Army pattern stretcher, which was 1 foot 11 inches wide and 7 foot 9 inches long, including the poles, to negotiate around. And you can see the problem as illustrated here in the BMJ. As a result, as the British Medical Journal noted, it is common for the problem to be solved by lifting the patient on a blanket or on a stretcher over the parados or back wall of the trench and carrying to the regimental aid post over intervening ground. Such a practice took bearers and patients out of the safety of the trenches, leaving them exposed to the risks of both shelling and snipers. Twin trenches also limited maneuverability, as they could be, quote, nowhere wider than 24 inches, while the average width of a fully developed trench is not more than 4 feet at the level of the shoulder. Its course is invariably interrupted by angles around which an ordinary stretcher cannot be carried except by tilting. Trenches located where groundwater was low enough to allow for a trench depth of 6 feet, meanwhile, may have provided excellent protection for the men in them at the expense of only 3 layers of sandbag, according to the BMJ. But they were designed to be dug at such an angle that the bottom was 2 feet wide and ground level width was 4 feet wide, which if you've got a foot, nearly 2 feet wide stretcher means you can't put the stretcher down for a start, and doesn't give you a lot of maneuverability when it's being held. It was extremely difficult to carry stretchers, physically to carry stretchers along such trenches, even at shoulder height, again forcing bearers and their patients to leave the comparative protection that trenches offered for open ground. As we've seen, stretchers were improvised throughout the war, but there was little in the way of innovation in basic stretcher design. There's not a lot you can do in innovating the design of a stretcher. Certainly nothing to keep up with the innovations in trench design. The results were at best problematic and at worst life-threatening for wounded men and the bearers who carried them. If trench design made the transportation of wounded men more perilous for patient and carer alike, one innovation which was of unequivocal benefit to the patient was the Thomas splint. This was introduced as standard military medical use in 1915. It was named for its deviser, H.O. Thomas, and was designed to separate the ends of the bone in a leg fracture to prevent friction which might cause bone hemorrhage in transport. So they're blood vessels in the bone, which if they're not allowed, if they continue to be rubbed by friction, will carry on bleeding and cause massive internal bleeding in the leg. The splint is, in short, a simple form of mobile traction. For bearers, they added weight to an already heavy stretcher, but for men suffering from leg fractures, which weren't that uncommon due to shrapnel, they were lifesavers. Following their introduction, this is one of the most extraordinary statistics to come out of my research. Following their introduction, fatality rates from such leg injuries dropped from 80% to 15%. In fact, so effective was the basic design that a variation continues to be used by military medics on battlefields today. They're no longer metal and cloth. They're made of plastics, and they use Velcro rather than pinned bandages to hold them in place. But the basic design is the same. Thus, the Thomas splint is arguably the most effective and long-lasting medical innovation to be disseminated by the First World War. The effectiveness of the Thomas splint as a treatment can also be seen in the extent to which bearers improvise them themselves, as well as other forms of splint-aid transport. It's a lot easier to transport someone who isn't screaming in pain because the ends of their bone are rubbing together. A volume entitled The Soldier's First Aid, published in 1917, advises bearers on how to manufacture a Thomas splint out of a rifle, a bayonet scabbard, and the ubiquitous putty, all of which might be with a wounded man on the field of battle when the bearer went to pick him up. While actual Thomas splints were issued only to regimental medical officers to be applied once the man had been transferred to the regimental aid post, the ingenuity of rankers who acted as regimental stretcher bearers enabled the application of this life-saving treatment further forward in no man's land. Innovation thus combined with improvisation to save lives and alleviate pain and discomfort. A similar reliance on the skills, knowledge, and ingenuity of men of the ranks engaged in care provision can be seen in the treatment of shock, the most common condition suffered by wounded men. So shock isn't psychological shock. I want to start there. It's defined in the 1911 Military Medical Training Manual, which formed the basis of RAMC training during the war, as a condition produced by severe injury or emotional disturbance, where the man suffering shock becomes pale and cold. He lies in a semi-conscious and helpless state, the face pinched, the lips ashy, the temperature subnormal, the pulse feeble or absent. He often breaks out into a cold sweat and may have fits of shivering or be restless. So prevalent was shock as a condition that RAMC rankers were trained specifically in its prevention and treatment. According to the 1918 pamphlet, The Treatment of Wounded Men in Regimental Aid Posts and Field Ambulances, regimental stretcher bearers should be instructed in the gentle handling of patients and in the application of splints. Rough or unnecessary movement must be avoided as one of the most potent factors in precipitating shock. They were also to be made aware of the danger of wound shock and taught the urgency of preventing unnecessary loss of body heat during the carry back to the aid post. Loss of heat was both primary cause and the primary symptom of loss of physiological coherence, identified by the nursing historian Christine Hallett as the most significant definition of shock used during the war. So when a man was cold and pale, that was seen as being the prime symptom that he was in shock. The stretcher bearer's chief weapon in the battle against shock, therefore, was the humble army blanket. According to the authors of the treatment of wounded men, the chief protection of the wounded man against cold during the first part of his journey lies in the liberal use of blankets. At no time is the loss of heat more rapid than during the first 2 hours after wounding, and every effort must be made to prevent exposure to cold at this period. Nothing is more striking than the deterioration in condition that takes place when a stretcher case has been started on his journey without a blanket beneath him, as well as one on top. In cold weather and with shocked cases, a third must be added, and these illustrations show how that could be done effectively. The authors of The Treatment of Wounded Men also advised that regimental stretcher bearers should be supplied with a certain number of waterproof sheet blanket packets, each packet consisting of one blanket wrapped in a ground sheet. These are strapped to the stretcher, ready for use, and are returned to the regimental stretcher bearers as soon as they have delivered the wounded man at the aid post. The occasional loss of a blanket will be amply compensated for by the saving of a wounded man who would otherwise die from the effects of a carry on bare stretchers. So the cost of a man's life versus the cost of a blanket to the military is being compared there. This, of course, is in an ideal world. In the chaos of an actual station, as we'll come to in a moment, the return of blankets very rarely happens. So the authors go on to provide 3 pages of instructions, from which I've taken these images, on how to effectively wrap a patient for transport, and a further 9 pages on keeping patients warm and dry in the often insalubrious atmosphere of the regimental aid posts and dressing stations. So such advice was well-meaning but often problematic. Regimental Medical Officer Colonel David Rory noted in his memoir, An Officer's Luck in the War, that it was difficult to make suitable arrangement for dealing with blankets and stretchers soaked by the rain and mud from the long carry from the front line. When the casualty clearing stations were at last awake to the fact that blanket drying was not a troublesome sideshow, but an important factor in combating shock up the line, we had taken a step forward by which everyone benefited. But casualty clearing stations very often didn't have the time and the space to dry the blankets, which there certainly wasn't the space for in the aid posts or dressing stations. So yeah, the supply of clean, dry blankets is a point of contention throughout the war. For bearers and nursing orderlies, the constant requirement for clean, dry blankets created additional workload in terms of both recording the movement of these items, so they couldn't be hoarded by one unit, transporting them back to where they were most needed, and actually doing the cleaning and drying so they could be reused. That was the responsibility of the nurses. As with splints, the need to keep patients warm to prevent shock provided opportunities for more improvisation. Motor ambulances, for example, were modified so that by the end of the war, heat from the engine exhaust or radiator water was being transferred to the interior of the car via pipes, although earlier experiments tended to suffocate the men with the fumes. A more Heath Robinson-esque contraption, and this is possibly my favorite image from this talk, was the aid post sterilizer, which was fashioned out of 2 biscuit tins, a tea tin, a petrol tin, a butter tin, and a Primus stove. This particular improvisation reflected growing emphasis on the practice of asepsis, which also drove hospital-based innovations such as the Carrell-Dakin method of antiseptic wound drainage, which was introduced as standard practice in the British Military Medical Services in 1917. And as you can see, it involves quite a lot of apparatus. So while undoubtedly life-saving, this method was also time-consuming and labor-intensive, involving a huge amount of work for nurses and VADs. The apparatus consisted of a glass bottle, which was placed on a stand high above the patient's bed, a long piece of rubber tubing which ran from this bottle and was divided into several smaller tubes at the end, a series of tiny glass tubes which were fitted into rubber ones, and finally a number of narrow rubber tubes, the ends of which were placed in the bed of the wound. Every 2 hours, a nurse or VAD would do a round of the ward, going to each patient receiving the Carrell-Dakin treatment, opening a valve on the rubber tube and allowing the sodium hypochlorite to flow through the wound. That's the Dakin solution. Carrell designed the mode of delivery, and Dakin the solution. The aim was to keep the wound constantly bathed in antiseptic, but as you can see from this description, from Christine Hallett's book Veiled Warriors, it was one that really could only be carried out in a hospital, and the base hospital was the closest to the front line that this sort of antiseptic treatment could be employed. Although there are some examples of it happening in casualty clearing stations later on in the war, evidence of the extent to which these became static hospital institutions over the course of the war. At base hospital, the administration of the Carrell-Dakin treatment was performed primarily by nursing VADs such as Vera Britton, who does write about this in her memoirs. However, innovations such as the biscuit tin sterilizer also allowed developing medical knowledge about the importance of asepsis further closer to the front line to shape medical care in those more difficult and less salubrious conditions. Away from the cold and mud of the Western Front, which has been the focus of much of what I've been talking about, medical innovation was often driven by the landscape. This was also true of the Western Front, but even more so away from the Western Front. While infrastructure posed challenges for medical transportation in Europe, with pavé roads causing wounds to open in motor ambulances and single-track rail lines creating delays for ambulance trains, as we've already noted, in Egypt and Palestine, the lack of infrastructure proved an even greater challenge. While train lines did exist, including between Alexandria, the site of the main hospitals, and the military base at Kantara, there were no roads through the desert across which 3 years of campaigns were fought. Evacuation by motor ambulance was impossible, and manual carries across vast distances, the vast distances involved were too exhausting to contemplate. The solution? The ship of the desert, the camel, with patients strapped on either side into cassoles, which could be used either sitting or lying down. You can see sitting at the bottom, lying down at the top. Unfortunately, this form of medical transportation was by some way the least popular of any used during the war. That nickname for the camel, the ship of the desert, was well come by. Many men found themselves suffering from what was essentially seasickness on top of the pain of their wounds. Cassoles also appear to have been a particularly painful way of traveling, equivalent to a motor ambulance on pavé. As a result, many medical officers serving in these theaters of war spent a great deal of time thinking up alternative forms of transportation. There are records of experiments with wheeled stretchers, SAM sleighs, which met with mixed success. W.D. Fothergill recalled that during the trek across the Sinai Desert, we had sledges drawn by mules to carry the sick and wounded, although his description of the experience makes it clear that this was exhausting and difficult. One form of transportation, however, does appear to have worked. The wire road, which was described by Charles Ammons as mesh chicken wire pegged down at the edges, which fulfilled its purpose admirably of keeping wheels and feet from the surface. Fothergill also encountered such innovations. In his recollections, such roads were made of ordinary rabbit netting onto the top of the sand, of which he noted succinctly, in the words of the title of this talk, "It worked." To conclude then, the First World War was undoubtedly the context of medical innovations in both treatment and transportation. Such innovations were not, however, unambiguously beneficial, even if they were, unlike most military innovations, designed to save rather than take lives. They, along with advancing medical knowledge, could make life more complex and difficult for the men on the ground tasked with undertaking care and transportation in and immediately behind the front line, and also the women who served overseas. In response, men improvised, sometimes in ways which placed their own lives in danger, such as leaving trenches to carry stretcher patients with greater ease and comfort. The significance of these improvisations was twofold. In transportation, they aided the effectiveness of swift evacuation while limiting discomfort, re-emphasizing military medical priorities of keeping the front line and trench system clear of wounded where possible. However, improvisations also brought developing knowledge of medical treatments and their effectiveness closer to the front line, whether in the form of first aid or aseptic practices. In the case of first aid, such developments did help in the process of democratizing medical care, as suggested by Fiona Reid. The men of the ranks of the Royal Army Medical Corps, who were often the drivers of improvisational practice, thus had as important a role in defining how the First World War affected medicine as nurses, doctors, and scientists. Thank you very much.